Cost is one of the main objectives of a project. We want to bring the project in under budget. We want to do it for the amount of money that we said we would. In these videos we're going to look at how do we do that. So before we start on the cost management process itself, we're going to look at some of the definitions that you need to understand in order to understand the cost management process. So the first thing that you need to understand is what cost actually is. So cost is the money spent to produce something. Now on a construction project, it'll be things like labor, the materials, not just the materials that you're putting in the ground, but things like fuel and oil to power the machines that you have. So it's not just the materials used, it's also everything else. Tools, plant and equipment, the things that you use to produce the construction outputs. Now these may be used across several projects, but you still need to allow a certain amount for these things. So eventually the diggers are going to run are going to break down, and you're going to need to buy a new one. So when you are doing a project, you're allowing a certain amount of money for that new digger that has to happen in the future. Consents and permits, services, so this may be subcontractors, it may be someone doing surveying for you, all those sort of things. It may be someone connecting power, all those sort of things. Facilities, the site offices, the toilets, everything you need to sort of run the site, the access thing. And the overheads, these are the things that you need to run your business. So all of those things are costs, and there are many more. Now that's just for a construction site. For a consultancy design project, they also have costs, but they're a little bit different. So they've got labor, they've got the people doing the designing, the people doing the drafting, the materials, not so much important, but tools, the computers you use. Overheads, there would be the company offices that you're sort of working in. Services, there'd be sub-consultants that you might need. So you might need someone to do your geotechnical investigation or something like that. So this is not just costs are not just something that construction companies have. Every company has costs, and that is the money spent to produce what they need to produce. In the case of a construction company, it is to produce a bridge or a building or whatever it is. In the case of a consultancy doing design, it is a design. So it may not be something physical, it may be just a set of ideas. So the types of costs, you've got direct costs, which are costs that are directly related to the production of what you're producing. So for a project, say a road building project, the direct costs are all of those costs involved in building the road. And that's divided into two. So the first is net costs. Those are the net costs are the costs required to do the actual work. So that'll be the labor doing the work, the plant, the materials that you're required to put into it, the subcontractors you bring on site. So all the things that are physically producing the product. In the case of a design, it would be the people doing the design work and producing the drawings and contract documents. In addition to that, there are on-site overheads. So those are overheads that are part of the direct costs of doing the work, but not physically doing it. So that'll be things like managers. The managers, the supervisors, who are not actually physically doing the work, but they're supervising the people that are. That would be things like the site officers and the portaloos and things like that. While they are not part of the actual thing being constructed, they are essential for it to be able to do it. So these are things that enable the works to be done. In addition to that, there are the costs of running a company. These are indirect costs. So there are indirect overheads. These are the people that are not on site but are actually supporting the project works. So that'll be the people like the person at the office doing the timesheets. There might be a senior engineer who's overseeing the whole project. He's not on site, but he's overseeing it. So those are the indirect overheads. In addition to that, most construction is carried out by a construction company who has a head office as well. So there's head office costs, the costs of doing business as a construction company or as a consultancy. That's the cost of running the company. So that might be the company head office, the office building itself, the equipment in the office, the office manager, the people that are actually running the company. So all of those costs there all need to be incorporated into whatever project you're doing. So when you're doing the project, you're not just considering the actual amounts that are spent on doing it. There's those overheads and the head office costs that you also need to incorporate into the project costs. So let's look at another concept, the budget. So each project or anything in particular, even a business, they all have a budget, and the budget is the money allocated to carry out, in this case, project works. Or in the case of a business, it may be money allocated to run a business. But in our case, we're looking at projects. So it's the money that we've allowed to carry out those project works. And the way you normally do it is, there is the total amount we've allowed to do this. In this case, it's a roading project. There is the amount of money that we've allowed to sort of do it. So there's the bottom line. But the way that you want to manage it is you want to break it down into smaller parts. That amount there is quite a coarse measure. By breaking it down into different work packages, as we did when we were doing time management, we are able to better control it. So we break it down into smaller parts, we estimate the costs of each of those smaller parts, and we add them all up to do that. Now those each one of those items there would include the direct and indirect costs, the costs of actually doing the work, plus profit, the company profit, how much money the company owners want to make on it, and a contingency. Now contingency is a certain amount of money to cover risk. It may be when you're doing the topsoil removal, you get a rainy day and you can't work. So there's the risk that you're not going to be able to work on that day, and that you may have to spend more money on that particular item than you allowed for. So what you do is you put a certain amount in on top of that. So the total amount of actually doing the work might have been $20,000, and you thought, well, if it rains, I'm going to lose a day, so I'm going to allow another $2,600 in case it rains to cover those costs. So that's what contingency is all about, is dealing with the risks. So some things are more risky than others. For example, topsoil removal, cut to fill, you're outside, you're dealing in dirt. If it rains, it could be a major problem. So there would be a significant contingency here. But bonds and insurances, for example, there's probably no risk. It's a very easy thing to do. You ring someone up and you get a bonded insurance put in place. And you know how much that is ahead of the project. So some things are more risky than others and would have a higher contingency than others. And the way you do it is you figure out each one of these amounts and you add them all up together to get the total budgeted amount. Revenue is the other side of costs. So you've got costs to do business, costs to do a project. Revenue is the money you earn from those company activities. In our case, the money we're earning from the project. And profit is revenue minus costs, or it can be loss as well. So you can see here we've got revenue, this much money for revenue, and this much money for costs. So it cost us this much, or this is the amount of money that we've made on our project, and this is the amount of costs. So the difference between the two is our profit. Now if your costs are actually more than your revenue, then that profit is not a profit, it is a loss, and you don't want to do that because your company is paying money to do the job. Notice that the revenue is much the same here. Most engineering work is done using contracts where a fixed price has been agreed. Now that fixed price, the contract price, is the revenue that the client has said is the revenue that you'd expect to make from that project. It is the amount of money the client is going to pay you to do that particular job. And you can't go to the client later on and say, oh, our costs were more than what we thought, we made a mistake, can you pay us more money? Because the client's going to say no. So oftentimes in engineering projects, especially design and construction, the revenue, the amount of money you're going to make on it, is constant. Your job is to make sure to manage those costs so that you're bringing it in on profit, rather than being in this situation where you're making a loss. Having said that, sometimes there may be variations. There may be the client might add more work or take work away, so that revenue amount may go up or down, depending on what the variations are. So it can change if the client adds work, or if there's stuff that the client is responsible for, but normally you try to bring it in on the contract amount that you estimated. Cash flow is the estimate of the expenditure by time. So here's a cash flow table. So you can see there's our budget from the previous slide. There's those numbers that we sort of estimated there, and there's the total amount. But now what we've done is we've taken these numbers and we've said, when is that expenditure happening? So the establishment, that $2,700, is happening in week 1. The bonds are happening over the duration of the project, so that's $3,500 is spent in 5 lots of $700 over the 5 weeks. The subgrade preparation, we start in week 2 and we do most of it in week 3, so it's split over those two there. So what you get out of that is this amount sort of split over. So week 1 we expect to spend $26,000, week 2 $136,000, and so on. And what that tells you is when you need the money, because these costs are money that you have to pay out of your bank account, and you need to make sure that your bank account has that money in it. So this tells you, in week 2 I need $136,000 to be able to cover the expenses in week 2. Now that's quite a useful way of doing it, but another way of looking at it is cumulative. So what we do is, there's our cash flow from the previous slide, and we do the cumulative total, and that's this green one here. So you can see that the cumulative total week 1, the amount of money we've actually spent in week 1 is $26,000. In week 2 we spend another $136,000. The cumulative total is $162,000. So at the end of week 2 we will have spent a total amount of $162,000. At the end of week 3 we would have spent $320,800, consisting of the expenditures in week 1, 2 and 3. So you can see the cumulative total is building all the time, and at the end it is the total amount that you've spent on the project, which is exactly the same as what your budget is, hopefully. So that's, well, so this is all a planning document as well. So that tells you how the cash is going to flow out of your account. And if you put that onto a graph, so you've got time along the bottom here, and you've got cumulative total on the top here, you end up with this thing here called an S-curve, and this is quite a common curve for most projects. And you can sort of see what happens here. So the slope, the shallower the slope, the less money you're spending in a particular week. The steeper the slope, you're spending more money in that week than you would with a shallower slope. And so this tells the story of the project. You can see at the beginning, when you're starting to bring resources in but you're not quite going at full steam, you have a shallower slope there. Then you start bringing all of your resources are on site and they're all working, and you're all buying the materials in, and so you're spending quite a lot of money every week in costs to do the job, and this is when the bulk of the work is all happening. So you can see that the slope steepens up, and then towards the end you've done most of the work. Some of those resources are moved to other sites because they're no longer needed on your site, and so the rate of expenditure shallows up, and so you get this over here. So if you use your imagination, you can see that sort of looks like a reverse S, and that's why it's called an S-curve, and it just shows the different stages of a project. Expenditure building in the first part of it, a lot of expenditure happening in the middle, and then the expenditure tailing off as the project finishes. Now let's look at them both together. So we've got this picture here is for a construction project, contractors cash flow and revenue. So there's that S-curve. You have to use your imagination for that. So the S-curve is shown there, and the revenue. Now most construction projects, the revenue are what's called progress payments. So every month, in this case, the client will pay the contractor a certain amount of money to cover some of the works that they've done. So you can see that the contractor spent this much money here in the first month or the second month, but he's only getting paid that much. So each one of these are progress payments made, and notice that's cumulative. So this one here is this much they'll be getting paid in month 3, this month in month 2, this much in month 1. So these are cumulative. You can see that the shaded area up to here is money that the contractor has to borrow. So at this point here, for example, he has been paid this much money, but he spent this much money. So he either has that money, this difference here, in the bank, or he goes into overdraft, or he takes out a loan. So he has to make up the difference. So up until now he hasn't made any money on it. In fact, he's losing money, and it's only towards the end of the project, so right at the end here, that he's actually his revenue is more than his costs, and that is the way contracts are set up. So he's encouraged to work really hard and finish the project, because at the finish of the project, that's when he makes his profit. So this is the amount of money that he spent. Sorry, this is the amount of money that he's so this is the amount of money that he spent, the costs, and this up to here is the amount of revenue. So the difference between the two, revenue minus costs, is the profit he makes. Hopefully your S-curve doesn't go above there, because if it went above there, then you would have made a loss, and that's not good. If you keep on making losses, you'll soon go out of business. Now that is for a construction project. It would be much the same for a design project with a consultant. Once again, they would be getting progress payments as they go, maybe not as many, and once again they've got costs building as well. Lastly, I want to look at this one here where we've got the client's cash flow. So this is another use of the cash flow concept. So the client will produce a cash flow. So we're talking about the big picture here. So we're talking about a project, say a client wants to build a building or something like that, from initiation all the way through to completion. So at the start he'll hire a consultant, he won't be spending too much on the feasibility, then he'll get into the design and he'll be doing a little bit more, spending a bit more money, then the rate will pick up a bit. Then the construction happens and the rate sort of steepens, they're spending more money as they go, and then towards the end of the commissioning it's actually tailing off as the contractor has been paid most of his money and he's just finishing everything off. Now the client is using this to figure out, how am I going to finance this? How am I going to pay for these works? Now he could theoretically just borrow this amount of money right at the start, but then he's actually got this money sitting in his bank and he is paying interest rates on it. So his objective is to minimize cost, and one of the significant costs he'll have is interest rates, the costs of borrowing money. So he doesn't want to borrow too much money, because the less money he borrows, the less interest he has to pay. So what he'll do is at the beginning he'll say, okay, well I'll borrow this much money and that'll get me through to this time here, and then when I get here I will borrow some more and that'll get me through to there, and then when I get to here I'm going to borrow this much more and do that. So what he's got there is a plan. This is how I'm going to finance the project, and it gives him a pretty good idea of what his interest rates are going to be, what his interest costs are going to be, and he can plan that to try to minimize those interest costs and therefore maximize his profit. So that concludes this video. The next one is talking about the cost management process itself.